The desert does not kill with warning. It kills with silence. Beneath the endless California sky, in a landscape where twisted Joshua trees claw upward like specters, a single mistake can transform beauty into a death sentence. On the morning of May 22nd, 2018, 35-year-old writer Claire Nelson stepped into Joshua Tree National Park searching for peace. By nightfall, she would be lying broken on the rocks, her pelvis shattered, her body pinned by pain in a wilderness that swallows the cries of the lost. It had begun as an ordinary decision, the kind people make every day. Go for a hike. Claire wasn't reckless. She wasn't a thrill seeker with something to prove. She was thoughtful, organized, even cautious. She had water, snacks, her phone with downloaded maps, and a spirit tempered by years of experience traveling alone. But that morning, what she sought was adventure. It was escape. She had been house-sitting for friends near Joshua Tree, recovering from the burnout of her professional life. After years working in media, she had come to the desert looking for quiet, for solitude, for answers. Hiking the land felt like communion with something ancient, something bigger than herself. Joshua Tree National Park is not a gentle place. Spanning nearly 800,000 acres, it is a collision zone between two deserts, the high, dry Mojave and the lower, harsher Colorado. To the uninitiated, it looks like an open playground of stone and cactus. To those who know it well, it is a trap of extremes. Temperatures swing violently, shade is scarce, and trails wind through boulder fields that lure hikers off course with their deceptive shapes. People underestimate it all the time. Many do not return. Claire didn't see danger in those first steps. The day was clear, the sky wide, the air charged with that hypnotic desert stillness that feels like the world itself is holding its breath. She followed the trail, admiring the surreal landscape. The spiny yucca is frozen mid-gesture, the granite monoliths piled like ruins of some forgotten temple. It felt like she had the entire desert to herself. Every footfall pressed her deeper into the silence, a silence so complete it seemed alive. But silence conceals. It hides the fragility of the human body. It hides how close the line between control and catastrophe really is. When Claire shifted off the marked trail and began clambering over rocks, she was still only minutes from safety. It felt harmless, a small detour, the kind of exploration countless hikers make without incident. The ground looked solid. The stones looked dependable. But in Joshua Tree, nothing is as secure as it seems. The moment arrived without warning. One step, a slip, and then gravity seized her. She fell hard, 25 feet onto unyielding stone. The sound of the impact echoed inside her body. Pain ripped through her pelvis, and she knew instantly that something was terribly wrong. She tried to move and could not. Her hips screamed in agony. Her legs felt useless, heavy, as though the desert itself had pinned her to the earth. The hike was over. Her life, as she had known it, was over. In one brutal instant, she had gone from solitary wanderer to stranded casualty. The phone in her pack was there, but useless. No service in the desert's dead zones. Her water and food might last hours, maybe a day, but not long enough for the wilderness to show mercy. And she had not told anyone exactly where she was going. She lay there, staring at the sky, realizing she was trapped in an indifferent expanse. The desert looked infinite, but for her, it had become a cage. The same vastness that had promised clarity now mocked her with silence. Nobody could hear her. Nobody even knew she was missing. That morning, she had woken up searching for peace. By evening, she understood the truth that so many before her had learned too late. Joshua Tree does not forgive. A single misstep had delivered her into a nightmare where the only certainty was pain. What began as a simple decision, go for a hike, had already become a story of survival, and it had only just begun. The fall was sudden, violent, and absolute. 1 second. Claire Nelson was shifting her weight on sun-warmed rock, eyes searching for her next step. The next, she was tumbling into nothing, her body dragged down by gravity with a speed that left no time for instinct. Her scream caught in her throat as stone and air blurred together. Then came the impact, a bone-shaking collision with the desert floor. Pain detonated through her body like an explosion. Something deep inside her snapped. She lay still, stunned, waiting for her mind to catch up with the violence her body had just endured. The silence that followed was almost cruel. There was no echo, no rush of sound to mark the event. Just stillness, broken only by the frantic beating of her own heart. For a few seconds, she tried to believe she could simply stand up and brush herself off. But when she shifted even slightly, pain screamed through her pelvis, so sharply it stole the air from her lungs. Her legs felt useless, disconnected, as if they no longer belonged to her. She had fallen 25 feet, and her pelvis had shattered on impact. In that instant, she knew she would not be walking out of Joshua Tree. The human mind bargains with disaster in strange ways. At first, she told herself she only needed a minute to catch her breath, that the pain would dull, that maybe she had only bruised herself badly. But as the minutes dragged on and every movement lit her body on fire, the truth could not be ignored. She was immobilized. She could not crawl. She could not drag herself towards safety. Her body, once a vessel of independence, had become a prison. The desert offered no sympathy. The sun bore down with unrelenting heat, pressing against her skin until sweat pooled and evaporated. Each breath felt heavy, dry, drawn from air that seemed to parch her lungs. She looked around at the boulders enclosing her, ancient stone carved by centuries of wind, and realized how invisible she was. From the trail above, she would be little more than a shadow hidden in rock. From the sky, just another figure swallowed by the desert sprawl. She might as well have fallen into another world. Her phone was still in her pack. She pulled it out, hands trembling, and stared at the screen as if salvation might glow there. The battery was fine. The maps were still there. But the signal bar mocked her. No service. The desert was vast enough to consume even technology. She was cut off. There would be no call for help, no lifeline. The device she carried as a tether to the world had become nothing but glass and weight. The reality of her situation began to sharpen. Nobody knew precisely where she was. She had told friends she was going hiking, yes, but not exactly which trail. To them, she could be anywhere in Joshua Tree's 800,000 acres. Even if she were reported missing, searchers would be looking for a needle in a desert of stone. Her stomach tightened with fear. The thought crept in, no one is coming. Hours bled together as she lay there, the sun shifting above her like a slow, merciless clock. Her body throbbed with pain that grew sharper, deeper, until it felt like knives grinding against her bones. She shifted onto her back, the only position that dulled the agony slightly, and tried to ration her movements. Each time she reached for her water bottle, it cost her. Every small adjustment demanded courage. She understood that her survival would depend not only on the supplies she carried, but on how well she conserved the strength that remained. The desert began to reveal its other dangers. Insects skittered nearby, their small movements amplified by her immobility. The possibility of snakes or scorpions slithering into her path gnawed at her mind. She was defenseless, unable to leap away or even roll quickly if threatened. The land was alive, and she was pinned down, helpless within it. As daylight waned, a new terror crept in with the lengthening shadows. Night in the desert is no gentler than day. The heat bleeds away quickly once the sun drops, and cold settles like a shroud. Claire had come dressed for hiking, not for immobilization in the open. The clothes that had felt suffocating hours earlier would soon feel thin against the desert chill. Worse than the cold, though, was the darkness itself. She knew the silence would deepen. She knew her imagination would turn every sound into a predator. But fear alone could not be allowed to take control. She forced herself to focus on survival. She counted the sips of water, letting the liquid linger on her tongue before swallowing. She nibbled on small pieces of food, spacing them out, willing them to stretch longer than her body thought possible. She took mental notes of her surroundings, memorizing the contours of the rocks, as though imprinting her location in case rescue did come. Her mind worked furiously to build order in a situation descending into chaos. The pain, however, was constant. It pulsed with her heartbeat, a reminder that her pelvis was shattered and her mobility stolen. Any hope of dragging herself back to the trail evaporated as she tested small shifts and felt the agony deepen. She was confined to the spot where she had fallen. The realization carried its own horror. If no one found her, she would die here alone, hidden in the folds of Joshua Tree. As night finally fell, the desert transformed. The temperature dropped sharply, and the stars burned with unblinking clarity overhead. The silence grew heavier, pressing into her ears until her own thoughts felt too loud. She curled into herself as best she could, fighting shivers, every breath a struggle between pain and fear. Hours earlier, she had been a hiker enjoying the desert's beauty. Now she was a casualty, pinned to stone, waiting for fate to decide whether she would be discovered in time. The fall had been swift. Its consequences would stretch on, measured in long, agonizing hours that had only just begun. The desert had claimed her mobility. Soon, it would begin testing her will to live. When dawn returned to Joshua Tree, the desert looked almost merciful. The morning light softened the edges of the rocks, painting the landscape in pale gold and casting long, delicate shadows. From a distance, the scene could have been mistaken for serene, a peaceful morning in one of America's most iconic parks. But for Claire Nelson, lying broken among the boulders, the rising sun was not a blessing. It was a sentence. Her first night had passed in fragments of pain and cold. Sleep had been impossible. Every time she drifted toward unconsciousness, a jolt of agony from her shattered pelvis dragged her back into awareness. Her body throbbed in rhythm with her heartbeat, and the chill of desert air gnawed through her clothing. By the time the horizon began to pale, she felt hollowed out by exhaustion. The new day brought no relief, only the promise of heat. Silence ruled the desert. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of indifference. There were no voices, no footsteps, no engine hums. Only the faint stirring of wind across stone and the occasional scratch of something small moving in the sand. Each sound seemed amplified because of how empty everything else was. She strained her ears to the crunch of boots, the whir of a helicopter, any sign of humanity. But nothing came. The desert gave no answer to her hope. It was then, in the stillness of morning, that reality began to settle fully. She was not simply injured. She was trapped, immobilized, invisible. If she had been able to walk, or even crawl, she might have dragged herself toward the trail. But she couldn't move more than inches without a scream of pain tearing through her body. Her prison was no larger than the patch of stone where she had fallen, and though the landscape around her was vast, the world had shrunk to that merciless spot. The phone was still useless, its screen lighting up with maps and digital reminders of a civilization just out of reach. She checked it obsessively, as though Shiro might conjure a signal. Each time, the bars refused to appear. The glow of the screen became another reminder of how cut off she was, how technology, so powerful in daily life, meant nothing in the desert's dead zones. Her water bottle was precious. She sipped carefully, rationing each swallow, letting the liquid roll across her tongue before sliding it down her throat. Every drop mattered. She knew dehydration could come quickly in this heat. The desert does not forgive the careless. Even with supplies, the clock had already begun ticking against her. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the heat. By mid-morning, the air grew heavy, the stone beneath her radiating warmth like a furnace. Sweat slicked her skin, but there was no escape. She couldn't shift into the shade without igniting agony in her pelvis. She felt herself baking under the relentless glare, the light so bright it seemed to bleach the world around her. The desert was alive, but it was not alive for her. It was alive against her. Fear sharpened as her thoughts turned outward. What if no one knew she was missing? She had told friends she would be out hiking, but she hadn't given details. Joshua Tree was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of acres of trails, canyons, and hidden corners. Even if a search was launched, how could they possibly know where to look? She imagined the vast map of the park, her body just hidden in the folds of stone. Still, she clung to fragments of hope. Perhaps another hiker would pass by. Perhaps someone would notice her car parked longer than expected. Perhaps a ranger would spot something. She rehearsed what she would do if she heard footsteps, how she would call out, wave, make herself seen. But the morning gave way to afternoon, and no one came. The silence remained heavy and oppressive. As the hours dragged on, her mind began to drift. The pain was constant, but her thoughts moved in strange loops. She remembered home in New Zealand, the faces of friends, moments of ordinary life that now felt impossibly distant. She thought how fragile everything was, how easily it could end. The desert seemed to feed those thoughts, its vastness pressing on her until she felt small, insignificant. Time lost meaning. She counted sips of water, measured bites of food, but the hours blurred into one another. The sun eventually began its descent, the heat bleeding away as shadows lengthened. With the coming night, a new dread took hold. Darkness would return, and with it, the cold. She braced herself, already imagining the shivers, the racing thoughts, the isolation magnified tenfold. The desert was not content with one kind of suffering. It demanded both extremes, scorching heat by day, freezing chill by night. Her body weakened as the second night approached. She had survived 24 hours with shattered bones, dehydration creeping closer, and no sign of rescue. But survival is not measured only in the physical. It is also measured in willpower. And as she lay in the silence, staring at the fading light above the rocks, she understood that her greatest battle might not be against the desert's elements, but against her own mind. Joshua Tree had shown her its beauty before the fall. Now, it was showing her its indifference. The silence that had once felt peaceful was now suffocating. The vastness that had felt freeing was now terrifying. Alone, broken, and unheard, she entered her second night, knowing she'd become just another figure swallowed by the desert shadows. The land had claimed her body. The question was how long it would take before it claimed everything else. For hours, Claire lay in the blistering heat, every nerve in her body screaming from the fracture in her pelvis. Her backpack, which had been flung to the side during the fall, was just within reach. Summoning every ounce of strength, she dragged it closer, gritting her teeth against the agony. Inside was her lifeline, water, snacks, sunscreen, and her phone. Her trembling hands fumbled for the device. She pressed the power button, her breath shallow as the screen lit up. Relief swept through her. If she could just get a signal, she could call for help. This could all be over. She could be airlifted to safety, tended by doctors, and her nightmare would end. But at the top corner of the screen, where hope should have been, there was nothing. No bars, no service, just the empty icon mocking her. Joshua Tree is a land of silence, but it's also a land without cell towers. The park covers nearly 800,000 acres of desert and mountains, much of it uninhabited and out of range. Where Claire lay was one of those dead zones. Her phone, sleek and advanced, was now little more than a flashlight and a clock. Still, she refused to accept defeat. She lifted the phone into the air, twisting her body despite the lightning bolts of pain. She stretched her arm high, scanning the horizon for even a flicker of connection. Nothing. She tried again and again, angling the phone toward the ridges and open sky. Her eyes fixed on the screen, desperate for a single bar to appear. But the screen remained barren, indifferent to her suffering. The false hope cut deep. To have technology in her hand, the very device that had always connected her to the world, and for it to be useless, was a cruel trick of fate. It wasn't just a lack of service. It was a reminder of how utterly alone she was. No one knew exactly where she had gone. No one could track her. No one was coming. Not yet. As the sun shifted higher, Claire realized her phone was draining quickly in the heat. She turned it off to save battery, making the painful decision that it would be her last line of defense if she ever needed to use a flashlight or camera to signal rescuers. Turning it off felt like closing a door on hope, but keeping it on was a death sentence for the battery. The hours stretched on. Flies buzzed around her. Sweat slicked her skin, then evaporated in the dry air, leaving behind only salt and thirst. She looked at the trail in the distance, the path she had intended to follow, and wondered if hikers might pass. But her fall had carried her just far enough from sight that she was invisible. Her voice, even if she screamed, would be swallowed by the desert's vast silence. Her phone had always been her tether to life. But here, in Joshua Tree, it became a symbol of helplessness. It could do nothing but remind her of a world that felt impossibly far away. Claire stared at it, her reflection dim in the darkened screen, and understood a grim truth. She was not waiting on technology anymore. She was waiting on chance. And chance in the desert is cruel. As the desert sun slipped below the horizon, the searing heat gave way to a different kind of torment. The air that felt like fire hours earlier began to cool rapidly, sinking into a bone-deep chill. Claire lay sprawled against the jagged rocks, her broken pelvis locking her in place. She pulled her backpack closer, using it as a makeshift pillow, though every shift in her position was like being stabbed from the inside. She had read once that deserts were extremes, scorching during the day, freezing at night. Now, she was experiencing it with no escape. Her thin hiking clothes clung to her with sweat that was rapidly drying, leaving her shivering violently in the darkness. The pain was bad enough. The cold made it almost unbearable. The silence of Joshua Tree at night was not a silence of peace. It was a silence that swallowed everything. No cars, no voices, no hum of distant life. Just an endless void punctuated by the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. Every snap of a twig or shuffle of movement made Claire's heart race. Coyotes roamed these lands. Snakes, scorpions. She was wounded and immobile, exposed as prey in the middle of the open desert. The stars overhead were sharp, countless, almost oppressive in their brilliance. Normally, she would have marveled at such a sight. But tonight, the stars were not a source of wonder. They were a reminder how small and isolated she was. Under that infinite sky, she was just another lost body waiting to be claimed by the desert. Thirst gnawed at her throat. She sipped sparingly from her water bottle, rationing it with a grim awareness that it wouldn't last forever. Food she had, nuts, a granola bar, a few snacks. But food meant nothing without water. And water, under the desert sun, was life measured in drops. Her mind spiraled in the darkness. What if no one noticed she was gone? What if she was never found? She pictured her family in New Zealand, unaware that she was lying broken and helpless half a world away. She thought of the headline she had read before. Hikers found dead weeks later. Their remains discovered by chance. Stories of wilderness swallowing people whole. Was she destined to become one of them? To keep panic from overtaking her, Claire began speaking aloud. She told herself she would survive. She repeated her own name, her family's names, forcing herself to stay tethered to life. The desert was vast, but she was still alive, and she had to cling to that fact with every ounce of willpower. The hours dragged. Shivering, she tried to drift in and out of restless sleep, but every sound jolted her awake. The desert at night was alive in ways she had never noticed before. Something skittered nearby, too close. She held her breath, her heart hammering. Eventually, it faded into the darkness, leaving her with the echo of her fear. By the time the first faint glow of dawn began to bleed across the horizon, Claire was exhausted. She had survived the first night, but the desert had already begun its assault, and the sun, rising once again, promised new horrors. Her nightmare was just beginning. The first rays of sunlight crept over the ridges of Joshua Tree, painting the desert gold. To most, it would have been a beautiful sight. For Claire, it was the signal of another battle. She had survived the night, but now came the furnace. The desert does not forgive weakness. Within minutes of sunrise, the chill lifted, and heat began to crawl back into the rocks. By mid-morning, the air was searing, reflecting off every jagged surface around her. Claire felt it pressing down on her chest, heavy and suffocating, as if the desert itself wanted to bury her alive. Her fractured pelvis sent spikes of pain every time she tried to shift. She couldn't crawl to shade. She couldn't drag herself far enough to find cover. The rocks that held her were the same ones that burned her skin now, radiating heat like a stove. She tucked a piece of fabric under her to keep from searing her flesh, but the relief was temporary. The thirst was worse. She sipped carefully from her bottle, each mouthful calculated, each swallow guilty. She knew she had to ration, but her body screamed for more. Her lips were cracking. Her tongue felt swollen, rough against her teeth. Already, dehydration was setting in, and with it came confusion. The sun warped her sense of time. Minutes stretched into hours. Shadows barely shifted. The silence around her was broken only by the buzz of flies circling lazily, drawn to her sweat and stillness. She swatted at them weakly, but her movements grew slower, more labored. By midday, the heat became unbearable. Her body temperature rose dangerously high. Sweat no longer cooled her. It only drained her. The water she rationed so carefully disappeared into the air before it could give her strength. She felt dizzy, the world tilting as if she were spinning even though she hadn't moved an inch. Hallucinations crept in. At one point, she thought she heard voices, distant hikers calling out. She tried to shout back, her voice cracking, but the desert swallowed her cries. There was no one, just the heat, echoing in her mind, playing tricks to break her spirit. She turned her phone on once more, staring at the blank signal bar. Nothing. She tried raising it again, tilting it toward the sky, as if sheer will could pull service from thin air. But the desert doesn't bargain. The battery slipped lower. She turned it off again, choking back the sob that threatened to escape. As the afternoon dragged on, she realized she couldn't just wait for the hours to pass. She needed a system, something to keep her mind anchored, so she began writing in her notebook, scrawling thoughts, recording details, leaving traces of herself in case she didn't make it. The pen shook in her hand, but the act gave her focus. If she couldn't control her body, at least she could control her words. By late day, the sun began to sink again, but the damage was done. Her skin burned, her lips split, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had survived the second day, but barely. She could feel her body breaking down, each organ working harder to keep her alive. As the shadows stretched across the desert, Claire realized she wasn't just fighting injury anymore. She was fighting the desert itself. And the desert was winning. Back in civilization, life had continued as normal. Claire's friends assumed she was hiking, perhaps without reception. In the desert, a few hours of silence isn't unusual. But as the hours stretched into a full day, then into another, unease began to ripple through the people who knew her. Claire had told almost no one her exact plans. She hadn't left a detailed route or a check-in schedule. It was a mistake born of confidence, the kind many hikers make without realizing the risk. But it meant that when she failed to return, no one could say for certain where she was. Joshua Tree National Park is vast, nearly 800,000 acres of desert rock and winding trails. A single missing hiker could vanish without a trace. Her disappearance was reported. Park rangers were alerted. Search and rescue teams began to mobilize, but they faced a chilling reality. They had no starting point. Claire's car was still parked where she had left it, giving them a loose idea of her general area. Beyond that, she could have gone in almost any direction. And in Joshua Tree, any direction meant hundreds of possible miles. While helicopters scanned the desert from above, teams of rangers and volunteers began combing the trails. They called her name, searched for footprints, for dropped items, for any disturbance in the sand or brush. But the desert has a way of swallowing signs of life. Tracks fade quickly under shifting winds and searing heat. A cry for help can vanish into the void within seconds. Claire, meanwhile, had no idea any of this was happening. She lay wedged among the rocks, invisible from the main trail, her body broken and immobile. She couldn't hear the searchers. She couldn't see the helicopters. The rescue mission and her desperate fight for survival existed in two separate worlds, only feet apart, yet cruelly disconnected. The irony was brutal. She was not lost in the sense of having wandered far from civilization. She was less than a mile from where people hike daily. But her fall had carried her off-trail, into a crease of the desert that concealed her from view. From the ground, she was hidden by rocks. From the air, she blended into the desert's colors. Even the bright clothes she wore weren't enough to make her visible. As daylight waned, search teams pressed on. They knew the clock was ticking. A single night in the desert could sap a person's strength. 2 days could prove fatal, especially with limited supplies. And if she was injured, as many suspected, her chances dropped with every passing hour. In the silence of her rocky prison, Claire began to sense that time was against her. The desert was not going to wait. Her body was failing, and although strangers were out there searching, she remained hidden in plain sight. The line between rescue and death as thin as the shifting desert air. By the third day, Claire's world had shrunk to pain, thirst, and heat. Her pelvis was broken in several places. Every attempt to shift her weight sent agony ricocheting through her body. She had long stopped trying to move. The effort cost more energy than it gave. She had surrendered to stillness. Her body pinned, as if the desert itself were holding her down. Her water was nearly gone. Each sip now was measured like currency, her life reduced to milliliters. She wet her lips instead of swallowing, tricking her mouth into believing she had more than she did. The food in her pack was almost untouched. Nuts, a granola bar, trail mix, but her body rejected the thought of eating. Without enough water, food was useless, a burden more than nourishment. The desert sun returned with merciless consistency. Every morning it rose like a predator. Every afternoon it pressed her closer to the edge. She could feel her skin baking, her muscles tightening, her mind flickering in and out of clarity. Time became fractured. She would drift into a dazed half-sleep, then jolt awake, unsure if minutes or hours had passed. It was in this haze of pain and fear that Claire decided to document what was happening. She pulled her notebook from her pack, scrawling words in a shaky hand. Sometimes it was practical, notes on water, time, her condition. Sometimes it was messages, thoughts for her family, fragments of love and apology, words they might one day find if rescuers only discovered her body. She used her phone sparingly, recording voice memos when she had the strength, messages for her loved ones, quiet confessions of fear, acknowledgments that she might not make it. The device that had failed to connect her to the outside world now became a vessel of last words. She spoke, not knowing if anyone would ever hear them. Her thoughts grew darker. The desert was stripping her down, piece by piece, until survival itself became abstract. She imagined her body drying in the sun, blending into the rocks. She thought of the searchers who might walk past without noticing. She wondered if she would become another name on the long list of hikers lost to the wilderness. Hallucinations came more frequently. She saw shadows that weren't there, shapes moving in the heat waves. She heard voices whispering, calling her name, only to vanish into silence when she strained to listen. Her brain, starved of water and oxygen, was betraying her. By the end of the third day, Claire felt herself slipping. Her body was shutting down. Her mind was preparing for an ending she didn't want but could no longer fight. The desert had stripped her control, and now it was deciding how long she would last. Lying beneath a darkening sky, she looked at the stars again. This time, she didn't marvel at their beauty. She wondered if they were the last thing she would ever see. By the fourth day, Claire's body was on the edge of collapse. Her skin was scorched, her lips cracked and bleeding, her mind flickering between reality and delirium. She had written her goodbyes, recorded her final words. She believed she would die there, swallowed by the desert's silence. But beyond the ridges, rescue teams were closing in. The search had expanded. Rangers, volunteers, and helicopters combed Joshua Tree's vast expanse, working against a ticking clock. Each hour that passed lowered her chances. Yet one detail kept them searching with urgency. Her car, still parked near the trailhead. It was proof she was still out there. Somewhere, from the air, the desert stretched endless and barren. Searchers scanned for movement, for color, for anything that didn't belong. But from above, the rocks and sand blurred together. Claire's pale clothes and motionless body were nearly indistinguishable from the terrain. It was only by persistence and luck that she was finally spotted. A helicopter crew caught sight of something unusual among the rocks. The faint outline of a figure, unmoving, half hidden in the landscape. At first, they weren't certain. The desert often played tricks. But when the pilot circled back, the truth came into focus. It was her. She was alive. Barely. When rescuers reached her, they found a woman who had been reduced to sheer willpower. Her voice was weak, her body dangerously dehydrated, her pelvis shattered. Yet when they leaned over her, she was conscious. She had clung to life long enough for them to arrive. The helicopter lifted her from the desert floor, blades roaring against the silence that had entombed her for days. As the ground fell away, Claire's ordeal ended where it had begun, in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of Joshua Tree. But this time, she was leaving it alive. For those who had searched, it was nothing short of a miracle. The odds had been against her from the moment she fell. The desert had tried to claim her, as it had claimed so many before. But Claire Nelson had survived, and survival, in a place designed to erase the fragile, was its own kind of defiance. Claire Nelson was airlifted from Joshua Tree, clinging to life, her body fractured and dehydrated to the brink of collapse. Doctors later confirmed the extent of her injuries: a shattered pelvis, severe dehydration, and sun damage. She was placed in intensive care, and for days her body fought to stabilize. But against every prediction, she pulled through. The physical recovery was long and grueling. Multiple surgeries followed. Weeks of hospitalization turned into months of rehabilitation. Learning to walk again with metal plates and screws holding her pelvis together tested her resilience daily. Simple movements most people take for granted became monumental efforts. Yet after surviving 4 days in the desert with her body broken, Claire refused to surrender to pain and recovery. Emotionally, the ordeal left scars just as deep. The desert had stripped her down to her most vulnerable self, forcing her to confront death head-on. In interviews later, she admitted she had prepared for the end out there, writing farewell notes, speaking last words into her phone, accepting that her family might never see her alive again. That brush with death lingered long after her body healed. But so did gratitude. Surviving what should have killed her reframed her life entirely. She spoke openly about how the experience forced her to slow down, to listen to her body, to confront fears she had buried beneath a busy life. She had been searching for peace when she entered Joshua Tree. She found it, but not in the way she expected. She found it in survival, the kind of peace that comes from knowing life is fragile and worth protecting. Her story also became a lesson for others. Claire emphasized the importance of preparation, never hiking alone without telling someone your exact route, carrying emergency beacons or satellite devices, and respecting the wilderness for the danger it truly holds. Joshua Tree, with its alien beauty and deceptive stillness, was not a harmless backdrop. It was a predator in its own right, indifferent to human fragility. In the years since, Claire has shared her experience through writing and speaking. She turned her brush with death into a message of resilience, urging others to embrace life fully and prepare wisely when stepping into nature's extremes. Her survival wasn't just a stroke of luck. It was also a testament to her willpower, her resourcefulness, and the rescuers who refused to give up searching. Looking back, she described those 4 days as the longest of her life, suspended between existence and oblivion. Each sunrise felt like a cruel punishment. Each night was a descent into fear. Yet each hour she endured carried her closer to the sound of helicopter blades, the voices of strangers, and the miracle of rescue. Claire Nelson entered Joshua Tree seeking solitude. She left it forever changed. Her story is not just one of survival, but of awakening. It is a reminder that nature does not bend for us. It demands respect, preparation, and humility. And it is a reminder, too, of the thin line between life and death, and how quickly that line can shift with a single misstep. Most of all, her story is proof of something rare and powerful. Even in the desert silence, even when the body is broken and the odds impossible, the human spirit can still fight and win